Under the pale haze of a late September sunrise, William Mason stepped out onto the weathered wooden deck of his lakefront property, coffee in hand, and let the cool air sting his skin. It had been 3 months since he moved into the old house by Lake Fletcher. 3 months of quiet mornings, of the soft hum of loons and the creaking moan of pine trees in the wind. For a man who had spent the past 30 years as a municipal infrastructure consultant for city development boards across the Northeast, the silence was both unfamiliar and, strangely, unnerving. William didn't seek isolation. He never romanticized it. But after a career of battling zoning boards, managing political egos, and watching too many communities crumble under their own bureaucracy, he was ready for a life defined by something simpler, more grounded. The lake had been his family's once, decades ago, a cabin that belonged to his uncle who had fished and drank and grown old here. After the man passed, the place had sat dormant, unsold, unclaimed, until William made the unusual decision to leave his Baltimore apartment and take over the property himself. At first, the lake had seemed perfect. Calm, underdeveloped, surrounded by a patchwork of modest homes and summer retreats, it felt like a place immune to the noise of the modern world. There was a small village nearby, Wilmore, where time seemed to have paused somewhere between the late 80s and early 2000s. People were polite but distant. You could live 10 years beside someone and still only nod once at the gas station. That suited William. He wasn't a recluse, but he didn't crave connection either. He filled his days repairing the dock, replacing old wiring in the cabin, organizing a manuscript he had promised himself he would write now that he had the time. A reflection on the ethical failures of suburban growth and its impact on the modern American psyche. But within weeks, something began to feel off. At first, it was just a smell. Not strong, barely noticeable even, but sharp enough to make his nostrils flare. A sour, chemical note that drifted across the water at dawn and vanished by midday. Then came the fish. On a particularly cold morning, William found 3 dead bluegill washed up on the rocky bend near his dock. Their bodies were stiff, eyes glazed white, gills swollen and dark. He remembered staring at them for a long time, almost as if expecting them to twitch, to break the illusion of death. But they didn't. He took photos, uploaded them to his drive, and made a note to keep watch. Local residents didn't seem alarmed. At the village diner, when William casually mentioned the fish to a man who had introduced himself only as Greg, the response was a simple shrug. They die sometimes. Nothing to worry about. When pressed, Greg added that Lake Fletcher had its seasons, and that algae blooms sometimes choked the shallows when the heat dragged on too long. William nodded, but he knew something about that explanation didn't fit. The water wasn't murky green. There wasn't the usual film that came with an oxygen-depleted bloom. The fish weren't starved for air. They looked poisoned. He began to pay closer attention. He bought a water testing kit from a nearby town and started taking small samples every few days, documenting temperature, pH, clarity. His readings didn't show anything extreme, but that only made the situation more suspicious. Dead wildlife without visible bloom or runoff? It wasn't natural. Still, there was no obvious source, no factories, no farmland close enough to leak pesticide. The surrounding woods were thick, unbroken for miles in most directions. There were no marked storm drains, no culverts, no visible signs of construction or industry. Yet the smell grew stronger. One evening, standing by the dock, he noticed something new. The wind shifted just right, and he caught a whiff of it again, that chemical edge, and his eyes stung. He squinted across the lake and noticed something strange. The opposite shoreline had changed. He couldn't say exactly how. Maybe it was the way the light hit the trees, or maybe it was the low fog that rolled over the surface, but the rocks looked darker, like they'd been soaked in something. There was a boat ramp there, too, one he'd never seen anyone use, but the gravel around it looked flattened, as if vehicles had been driving over it regularly. That struck him as odd. He hadn't seen much boat traffic in the time he'd been there, and the local store didn't sell fuel or outboard parts. If people were using the ramp, they weren't from the neighborhood. The next morning, William woke early, drawn by a strange unease. The sky was cloudless, the air too still. He sipped his coffee, staring at the lake, and noticed movement near the same boat ramp. A small motorboat, a dull gray aluminum hull with no visible markings, glided toward the center of the lake. 2 men stood in it, both wearing dark clothing and hats pulled low. They didn't fish. They didn't speak. Instead, one of them moved to the back of the boat and lifted what looked like a large insulated canister. The other steered them slowly around a narrow cove, and then they disappeared behind a thicket of trees that blocked William's view. It should have ended there. But it didn't. William waited nearly an hour before the boat returned, now lower in the water than before. It docked briefly at the ramp, and the men unloaded something bulky, covered by a tarp. Then they drove away in a dark SUV that had been parked just off the gravel path. William wrote down the time, the direction, and tried to ignore the pulse in his throat. He didn't know what he had seen, but he knew how to recognize behavior that wasn't meant to be seen. He debated what to do next. Reporting it felt premature. He had no proof, just a growing collection of oddities, and a gut feeling that something was deeply wrong. He wasn't a paranoid man, nor a thrill-seeker. He believed in systems, in the importance of protocols and institutions, even after decades of seeing how poorly they often functioned. But this felt like something that would get buried the moment he made a formal complaint. He needed more than anecdotes. He needed evidence. Still, the question nagged at him. Why this lake? Why here? It wasn't economically important. It wasn't scenic enough for tourism. The few businesses that remained in Wilmore barely scraped by selling bait, propane, and gas station sandwiches. So what would drive someone to operate covertly on its waters? A few days later, his question found a new form. He received a letter in his mailbox. No stamp, no return address, just his name, typed neatly and tucked into a blank envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It read, "Stop looking. There's nothing here you want to understand." No signature, no threat, just that cold sentence, like a stone dropped into still water. William sat with the note for hours. He reread it, examined it for fingerprints, for watermarks, for anything. But it was a generic printer page. Someone wanted him to back off. That meant he had seen something. That meant he had been noticed. He folded the note, placed it in a file folder alongside his water readings and photographs, and walked outside. The lake was quiet again, its surface glass smooth, reflecting clouds that didn't yet exist. He stood on the dock, the boards creaking beneath his feet, and looked out over the water that had once felt like an escape. Now it felt like a puzzle, and he couldn't stop himself from wondering how far the rot went and how many people were willing to pretend it wasn't there. He didn't know what he was going to do yet, but he knew he wasn't going to let this go. Underneath the low-hanging sky of a dusky morning, the lake took on a flat gunmetal color that reflected nothing. William stood at the edge of the dock, his arms crossed, watching the water like a man who had already made up his mind. The note still sat on his desk inside, but its words were carved into his brain, playing on repeat like a splintered record. Stop looking. That wasn't just a warning. It was a confirmation. It meant he had seen something real, and that someone, somewhere, had decided that what he saw wasn't meant to be noticed, wasn't meant to be spoken about. He was being watched. Maybe not every day, maybe not closely, but someone was paying enough attention to know that he was thinking beyond what was socially acceptable in the sleepy folds of Lake Fletcher. It didn't frighten him, but it did something worse. It made him angry. Not the kind of burning fury that turns a man reckless, but the slow, deliberate kind that ignites with purpose. The kind that doesn't recede. By mid-morning, he was on the phone with a private environmental lab in Boston. It wasn't difficult to arrange. He spoke clearly, concisely, and didn't overshare. He simply explained that he needed a comprehensive toxicology panel on freshwater samples, with emphasis on synthetic compounds. Herbicides, industrial solvents, anything that shouldn't be in a lake untouched by major agriculture or manufacturing. They gave him the procedure, sent a courier pickup time, and requested samples taken in triple containment. William spent the next 2 days collecting water from 5 separate points: North Shore, South Inlet, near the old boat ramp, 1 mid-lake sample via rented kayak, and a 5th from the tiny marsh pocket behind his cabin. He stored each in pre-sterilized labeled containers and sealed them in a hard case with ice packs. He didn't tell anyone. Not the sheriff's department, not the local ranger, not even the store owner who always asked too many questions. When the courier arrived, he simply handed the box to a man in an unmarked sedan, received a confirmation number, and watched the vehicle disappear in a cloud of gravel dust. The report came back 5 days later via encrypted email. William sat at his desk, lit only by the desk lamp, and read the results twice, then a third time. The pH levels were consistent with the field tests he had run. Temperature was normal for the season. But it was the second half of the report that changed everything. High levels of phosphates, yes, but more alarmingly, an elevated presence of non-ilphenol, an organic compound used in industrial detergents, and worse, traces of dichloropropene, a soil fumigant typically used in large-scale farming operations. There was no farming anywhere near Lake Fletcher. The compound was carcinogenic, tightly regulated, and not something that should have found its way into recreational fresh water. Even more concerning was the detection of perfluorooctanoic acid, PFOA, a chemical used in non-stick coatings and fire retardants. William leaned back in his chair, hand against his mouth. These weren't naturally occurring. This was manufactured, purposeful contamination. Someone was using the lake, or something connected to it, as a dumping site. And given the absence of any official oversight or alarm, it wasn't being caught. Or worse, it was being ignored. He knew he had to get it on record. As much as he distrusted the performative nature of the local government, there were procedural thresholds that couldn't be skipped. He composed a letter to the Department of Environmental Protection, attaching the report, GPS coordinates of his sampling points, and a neutral cover explanation. Just a concerned resident, requesting a site inspection. He sent a second copy to the regional EPA liaison office in Albany. He wasn't naive enough to expect immediate action, but he knew that once the paper trail began, it would be harder to silence him. The system was flawed. But even flawed systems respond to documentation. It wasn't about justice yet. It was about visibility. A week passed. Then 2. No response. Not even a confirmation email. He checked the tracking receipts. The letters had been received, signed for. Still, silence. He considered driving to Albany himself, but something told him to wait. Not out of patience, but out of strategy. He needed to know more before showing his face. Instead, he drove to the nearest regional library and searched property records. Most of the land around Lake Fletcher was marked as private. Old deeds, family lots, inherited spaces, but a small parcel on the southern edge near the boat ramp had changed ownership just 2 years ago. The name listed on the filing was unfamiliar: Greenwater Holdings, LLC, a Delaware-based company. No office listed, no local contacts. The same company, he would later learn, had recently purchased defunct farmland 2 counties over, land which coincidentally had experienced its own issues with water runoff and sickness in livestock. There was a pattern, but it was buried under layers of corporate shells and jurisdictional fog. Still, William didn't stop. He filed a formal request through his lawyer, an old contact from his city days, to obtain public documentation on Greenwater Holdings' zoning activities. That same week, he noticed the boat again. Same gray hull, same 2 men. This time they weren't just circling. They were parked, stationary. One stood at the bow looking directly toward William's property. Not through binoculars, not subtly. Just standing, staring, not moving for 10 minutes. Then they started the motor and glided away, leaving a wake of silence in their path. 3 days later, the warning escalated. William returned from a trip to town and found the remains of his kayak impaled on a fence post. It had been cut clean down the center with something industrial. No note, no message, just the unmistakable implication. We see you, and we can reach you. The sheriff came, took pictures, filed a report, but offered no commentary. William watched the deputy the whole time. He didn't write much, didn't ask many questions. There was something in his face that suggested restraint, like a man who knew more than he was allowed to say. The following Monday, William's mailbox was gone. Not damaged. Gone. The pole it stood on, the concrete base, everything. In its place was a patch of freshly turned soil and a small placard jammed into the ground, printed with a single sentence in Helvetica. Please stay quiet. It helps everyone. That was when he knew he wasn't just dealing with negligence. This was orchestration. There was intent behind every piece of silence, every unexplained edit to the landscape, every institutional delay. Someone was suppressing the noise before it could reach a pitch. He adjusted. He changed his patterns. He stopped using the same grocery store, rotated his routines, never walked the same route twice in the woods. He installed motion cameras along the edges of his property, subtle, low to the ground, masked by tree bark and brush. Not to build a case, not yet, but to understand who was moving through the shadows. The footage showed little, but enough. A truck at 3:12 a.m., pulling up near the southern trailhead, idling for 27 minutes. A figure walking the perimeter of his fence at 4:00 a.m., then vanishing into the trees. William documented everything. Not for the sheriff, not for the press, for leverage. He wasn't sure what his endgame was yet. He wasn't thinking about courtrooms or articles or televised interviews. He didn't want to be a hero. He didn't want to be remembered. He just wanted someone to acknowledge that the lake was dying, that people were letting it die, and that maybe, just maybe, they were doing it on purpose. And that was enough to make him dangerous. Then, 2 weeks after sending his letters, the first real reply arrived. A plain envelope, no letterhead. Inside, a single sheet, a scanned copy of his DEP request, now stamped, forwarded to county records, no immediate action scheduled. It wasn't a denial. But it was worse. It meant delay. It meant shelving. The kind of bureaucratic drift that buries real crises under procedural sand. William read the stamp again and again. It didn't say the data was wrong. It didn't say there was no threat. It simply said, not now. He went outside, walked to the edge of the dock, and stared at the lake again. The water looked darker. Still calm, still silent, but no longer reflecting anything at all. The weather turned colder without warning, like a door slammed shut on the season. The lake, once glinting with a deceptive tranquility, now sat leaden and unmoving, as if bracing for what was coming. William felt it too. Something tightening. The quiet no longer seemed like peace. It felt like suppression. Not just in the conversations that never happened or the answers that never came, but in the landscape itself. The birds had gone early, the shoreline reeds wilted faster than usual, and the frogs that normally sang through the dusk had fallen silent, as if they too knew better than to make themselves known. William's house remained intact, untouched, but it had begun to feel like a spotlight, too visible, too singular. His nearest neighbor to the east, a part-time resident who only appeared on weekends, hadn't been seen in over a month. The blinds on his cabin remained shut, the lawn overgrown. Another to the west, a man named Arnold who used to wave with 2 fingers from the deck, now turned his back when William passed by in town. People were choosing sides, quietly. The cameras he had installed, though modest, proved increasingly valuable. Every 3 or 4 nights, someone appeared on the footage, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs. Never armed, never overtly threatening, but always methodical. One man in particular, a tall figure with a red windbreaker and deliberate movements, walked the same stretch of forest path behind William's property, always between 3 and 4 a.m., always alone. He didn't vandalize or steal or make any aggressive gestures. He simply walked, paused briefly at the edge of the dock, and left. William saved each clip, cataloged them, added timestamps and ambient weather conditions. It wasn't paranoia driving him, it was preparation. He had no intention of playing the victim if things escalated. It was around this time that he received a letter that wasn't anonymous. It arrived in a thick manila envelope, with an official seal from the county registrar's office. Inside was a copy of a complaint filed by a property developer, Midland Resource Solutions. The company had recently acquired several tracts of land on the far end of Lake Fletcher and was filing for a conditional use permit to revitalize the southern shoreline infrastructure to accommodate light commercial use. Attached were schematics, boat slips, storage facilities, and, most tellingly, a runoff diversion plan that intersected with William's recorded contamination points. He flipped through the pages, his pulse quickening not from fear but from clarity. This was it. This was the engine. Everything up until now, the evasive silence, the planted warnings, the vanishing mailbox, had been about getting to this point without friction. And now it was here, being cloaked in legal jargon and regulatory doublespeak. He reached out to the environmental lab again, requesting clarification on the previous report. The lead analyst, a blunt-spoken woman named Karen, agreed to a follow-up call. During their conversation, she mentioned something that caught him off guard. The specific chemical profile they had detected suggested the pollutants were not byproducts of local use or accidental leakage. They were consistent with targeted water. Treatment runoff, often used to suppress organic growth during excavation or shoreline drilling. She asked if he had noticed any signs of underwater dredging or silt barriers. William had not, but he had seen something else: barrels. Not floating, but positioned just under the surface along the cove near the boat ramp. He had assumed they were old moorings or discarded equipment, half submerged and forgotten. Now he wasn't so sure. Determined to confront the source, he attended a county board meeting 2 towns over where the Midland proposal was to be discussed. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he listened, closely. Representatives from Midland described their project as a sustainable shoreline enhancement, designed to bring economic opportunity to the region while preserving the natural character of the lake. Their presentation was slick, professional. Renderings, buzzwords about job creation, community access, and minimal ecological footprint. No mention, of course, of the independent contamination analysis. No disclosure of chemical presence. And when William finally took the floor, calmly, without accusation, he asked only one question. Had any environmental risk assessments been filed to support this proposal? There was a pause. The representative smiled. We've complied with all applicable local guidelines. A non-answer. A deflection. William submitted his lab report to the clerk on record and sat down. No one looked at him directly afterward. Not the developers. Not the board. It was as if he had committed an indecency by naming something they had agreed not to see. Within 48 hours, the retaliation became tangible. Not violent, not overt, but insidious. William's access to his private trail, the one leading from the back of his cabin to the marsh, was suddenly blocked by a freshly installed gate. No signage, no explanation, just a thick chain and padlock stretching across the old wooden fence posts. When he called the county office to inquire, he was told that the land in question had been recently reassessed and deemed municipal access, not private easement. His protests were logged but not answered. The next day, a citation was left under his door: illegal vegetation growth near waterfront edge, punishable by fine. It was absurd. The plants in question were natural, untouched. He hadn't touched a blade of grass since July. He knew this wasn't about compliance. It was leverage. He began to document every interaction. He kept a log on his desk with date, time, incident, and response, or lack thereof. Not out of paranoia, but to ensure clarity. When you're being targeted, even subtly, it's important to have a timeline, a chain, something immutable. He also began to notice things in the village, changes in tone. People who had once been neutral now avoided his gaze. A woman at the post office who used to make small talk now wordlessly handed over his packages. At the diner, conversation shifted when he entered. He wasn't being ostracized. He was being quarantined. Made untouchable. The community wasn't against him exactly, but they were choosing not to be associated with him. He had broken some unspoken agreement. Don't make problems. Don't shine lights in dark corners. Don't threaten the fragile equilibrium that lets everyone pretend nothing is wrong. The most chilling moment came not from hostility, but from kindness. An older man who worked as a seasonal dockhand and whom William had barely spoken to approached him outside the gas station one afternoon. He didn't make eye contact. He just said, "You should think about taking a break. Maybe visit somewhere else for a bit. Not everything here is going to make sense to you." Then he walked away. It wasn't a threat. It was almost apologetic, and that made it worse, because it meant the man believed something would happen. He just didn't want to be the one caught near it when it did. William didn't respond to the warning. He didn't escalate. Instead, he sent a certified letter to the state environmental office, this time attaching not only the lab results but also a complete incident log, photos of the locked gate, copies of the citations, and a map of the proposed development in proximity to the contaminated zones. He added a personal note, not emotional but firm, stating that should any action be taken against him or his property, there would be legal and public consequences. He CC'd his attorney, his insurance provider, and a journalist acquaintance he hadn't spoken to in years, but whom he knew kept a soft spot for stories like this. He didn't send it out of desperation. He sent it to anchor himself, to show that he was no longer invisible. He wasn't trying to win a war. He wasn't even certain what he was fighting yet. But he understood now that the danger wasn't just to the lake or to himself. It was systemic. There were gears moving behind curtains and people choosing to look away. His role, if he had one, was simply to keep watching, and to make sure that when the curtain finally tore open, someone had a record of everything that happened behind it. The temperature dropped sharply during the second week of October, and the lake began to change character. What once reflected the sky now seemed to absorb it, the water turning opaque and dense, as though it were no longer part of the landscape, but its own, enclosed entity. William noticed that even the wind seemed to behave differently now. It didn't ripple across the surface like before, but curled around the trees in erratic patterns, as if the land itself had become unsure of its own mood. He started waking up earlier, not because he couldn't sleep, but because he wanted to get ahead of the silence. He had come to understand that the most unsettling things didn't make noise. They simply occurred quietly, and then waited to see if anyone would be brave enough to say them out loud. It was during one of these early mornings, with frost clinging to the grass like a final warning, that William discovered the shift in the waterline. It was subtle, barely 6 inches, but enough to expose a narrow band of shoreline that hadn't seen light in years. Along this stretch, near the far end of his property, he noticed what at first seemed like natural debris: driftwood, stone fragments, discolored sediment. But when he walked closer, he saw the unnatural symmetry. Two short metal rods planted deep into the lakebed stood in parallel. Between them, a rusted pipe angled upward, jagged and corroded, its mouth just barely visible. It looked like it had been intentionally hidden below the surface, positioned in such a way that even in dry months it wouldn't fully emerge. William crouched beside it, touched the rim, and recoiled slightly at the oily residue that clung to his fingers. He took photographs, not just of the pipe, but of the shoreline around it. The disturbed soil, the odd coloration of the reeds, the way the stones nearby were stained darker than those even a few feet away. He followed the pipe back into the woods as far as it would go, tracing a barely visible depression in the earth that disappeared beneath a series of man-made barriers, brush piles, false root structures, and eventually a small wooden hatch buried beneath forest debris. He didn't open it. Not yet. He returned to the cabin, uploaded the images, and sent them to his environmental lab contact, Karen, with the subject line: potential buried discharge system. Confirmation needed. Karen replied within the day. "This looks like legacy infrastructure," she wrote. "Possibly pre-regulation. Could be repurposed. If you can get a core sample from the pipe interior, we can compare it to your previous results. Be cautious. Wear gloves." That same afternoon, he rented a bore kit from a tool supplier 2 towns over and returned to the site with heavy gloves, sealable containers, and a second memory card for his trail camera, which he mounted discreetly facing the shoreline. It took an hour to retrieve a sample from inside the pipe. The residue was dense, clay-like, and had a chemical smell that seemed to settle at the back of his throat even through the mask. He sealed the container, labeled it with GPS coordinates, and packaged it for next day's shipment. As he walked back toward the cabin, he stopped at the crest of the hill, turned, and saw a vehicle parked on the opposite shore. A black SUV, half obscured by brush, engine idling. It remained there until nightfall. 2 days later, Karen called instead of writing. Her voice was steady, but there was a new edge to it. "I don't want this in email. What you sent matches runoff samples we've seen in 2 other locations in the past 5 years, both tied to remediation zones where industrial byproduct was buried and redirected without full disclosure. We're talking petroleum byproducts, nitrate solvents, some traces of hexavalent chromium. This is not residential waste, and it's not incidental. It's controlled." She paused, then added, "Whatever you're sitting on, Will, it's not just environmental negligence. It's illegal activity wrapped in old permits and silence." William asked if the lab could file the report directly with the State Department. Karen hesitated. "We can. But once we do, your name is in the system. And I can't guarantee how it gets handled from there. This stuff doesn't die in filing cabinets. It moves, fast and quiet, like someone wants it forgotten before it breathes." William thanked her and said he'd consider the timing. He didn't say what he was already planning. That night he returned to the hatch site with a crowbar, a flashlight, and the certainty that whatever was beneath that hatch wasn't meant to be found. It opened with more resistance than he expected, the rusted hinges screaming softly into the cold air. Beneath it was a narrow concrete shaft, maybe 4 feet deep, filled with loose gravel and capped by a curved metal fitting, some kind of junction valve, long since disconnected but never properly sealed. Nearby was a plastic tag, half buried, marked with a project number and the faded logo of a company William didn't recognize: Venterra Systems. He took everything he could carry. Before leaving, he smashed the hinge and scattered the gravel. Let them think it collapsed on its own. The next morning, he drove to the county records office under a different name, using an old consulting credential he still had from his corporate days, and requested zoning and industrial use permits for the area surrounding Lake Fletcher for the last 25 years. It took the clerk nearly an hour, but eventually she returned with a set of microfilm and 2 folders of paper documents, which William copied discreetly, page by page. Most of it was ordinary: permit requests, septic maps, shoreline ordinances. But one file stood out: a sealed amendment dated 2008, marked with restricted access under Municipal Ordinance B-97, allowing for temporary use of shoreline drainage infrastructure for emergency fluid redirection. It was signed by a now-deceased planning commissioner and co-signed by a representative of Venterra Systems. This was the connection he hadn't yet found. A loophole. Someone had created a legal shell, a back door through which industrial discharge could be routed during emergency conditions, without notifying residents or health authorities. But the language was vague, and the conditions never defined. It was a license to pollute under the guise of containment. William returned home and did something he hadn't done in years. He wrote a formal affidavit, not just a complaint, but a detailed account of every incident, every observation, every data point, cross-referenced with maps, property transactions, and sample analysis. He submitted it through a secure whistleblower channel linked to the State Environmental Protection Division, not anonymously but under full name, with attached credentials. He knew the risk, but also the strategy. If he made the record too large, too thorough, and too interconnected, then destroying it would raise more questions than letting it exist. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of lighting a flare over enemy territory: bright, loud, and too visible to ignore without attracting notice. Then he waited. Days passed. The trail camera footage remained uneventful. No visitors, no return of the SUV. The lake, as always, remained silent. But beneath that surface, William could feel the shift. The story had breached the surface now. The silence had become unsustainable. And once something becomes visible, even for a moment, it becomes vulnerable. That was the turning point, not in the form of a dramatic confrontation, but in a simple, undeniable truth. Someone else would have to answer now. The burden had shifted. He had done his part. The question was whether the system would pretend not to hear. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered not by the usual mail carrier but slipped discreetly beneath William's front door in an unmarked envelope. There was no return address, no stamps, no markings except for the thick typed words on a single sheet of paper inside, "You've forced our hand. Legal action has begun." It wasn't a cease and desist, not yet, but attached to it was a photocopy of a formal complaint, stamped and notarized, bearing the letterhead of a law firm from Albany, known for representing corporate environmental interests. The claim: defamation of character and interference with contractual development rights. William read it twice, then placed it carefully on his desk beside the growing stack of documentation he had assembled over the past several weeks. He didn't feel surprised. He felt clarity. This was escalation, not in the shadows, not through intimidation, but in the open. They were shifting tactics, moving from anonymous pressure to institutional pressure, the kind designed to drain time, money, and focus. It was a message. We know who you are, and we know how to slow you down. And they were right, in part. A legal suit, even a frivolous one, required response. William reached out to his attorney and forwarded the document. Her reply was prompt but measured. "We'll file a counter-motion for dismissal," she said. "But you should be ready. They're not just posturing. They're setting the stage for deeper control." And then came the second blow, less formal but more invasive. That weekend, William received a notice from the local zoning department informing him that a new inspection was scheduled for his property, ostensibly routine, triggered by recent adjustments to shoreline erosion policies. The language was dry, overly neutral, but William knew what it meant. They were coming onto his land, and they were going to look for anything they could leverage. Code violations, unauthorized structures, unsafe conditions. Anything that could justify penalties or, worse, temporary seizure for environmental remediation. When the inspectors arrived, 3 of them, 2 in state-issued jackets, 1 wearing a private consultant badge, William greeted them politely and recorded the interaction without apology. He watched as they measured setbacks from the dock, checked siding for rot, took photos of his septic tank access panel. One of them asked, too casually, whether he'd ever done any soil excavation near the marsh, particularly near what was now clearly identified as an unregistered drainage outlet. William kept his answers factual, calm. The inspection concluded with the promise of a written report within 10 business days. That same night, his trail cameras captured movement again. Not people, but equipment. A drone, low-flying and silent, passed over the rear edge of his property 3 separate times between 2 and 4 in the morning. It hovered briefly above the marshy clearing where the hatch had once been. William checked the footage frame by frame, noting the faint reflection of a red diode beneath the drone belly, a detail suggesting it wasn't recreational, but operated by professionals. He saved the footage to multiple drives and uploaded copies to off-site cloud storage. If they were going to escalate, so would he. He began reaching out quietly to other residents along the lake, people who, until now, had kept their distance or avoided eye contact. His first attempt was met with thin politeness and quick exits. But after a few more tries, he found a willing ear in a retired teacher named Eleanor, who had lived on the north side of the lake for over 30 years. Over coffee, she admitted what William suspected. The lake had been in decline for over a decade, and strange trucks had been coming and going at odd hours long before he moved in. She had reported dead waterfowl to local wildlife services 3 times in the past 5 years, and had been told every time that the deaths were due to seasonal parasite shifts. When she asked too many questions at a township meeting, her shoreline access permit was reevaluated and revoked on technical grounds. Another resident, a carpenter named Joel, confirmed that a group of men in utility vans had once tried to access his property through the back trail, claiming they were testing groundwater for septic compliance. They showed no credentials and left when he refused entry. They weren't here for septic, Joel said. They didn't even ask about my system. They were looking for something they didn't want to find on their side. William compiled these accounts, anonymized them, and began cross-referencing them with documented complaints from state databases. The pattern was unmistakable. Residents who asked questions found themselves suddenly in violation of obscure codes, or burdened with unannounced inspections, or quietly removed from advisory boards and committees. It wasn't long after that the first public meeting was called, an environmental stakeholder session organized by the county and featuring representatives from both the Department of Environmental Protection and Midland Resource Solutions. William attended, taking a seat near the back. The room was half filled with residents, some familiar, others new. The tone of the meeting was rehearsed optimism. Midland's speaker, a suited man with the permanent smile of a public relations consultant, opened with remarks about collaborative revitalization and public-private synergy. He introduced a series of slides showing before and after images of the southern shoreline, heavily edited to imply degradation that only their project could repair. When the floor was open to comments, William stood and asked a direct question. Can you confirm whether any of your development work involves existing buried infrastructure and whether any discharge points have been active in the past 6 months? The room fell still. The speaker hesitated, then responded with a deflection about compliance with all relevant regulations. William pressed again. Are you denying the presence of industrial contaminants recently detected in the lake, specifically PFOA and dichloropropene? That broke the rhythm. The speaker's voice faltered. And a second man, seated near the officials, interrupted with a statement that testing methodologies vary, and unofficial reports cannot be treated as conclusive without peer-reviewed validation. It was illegal, non-denial, carefully crafted, but it was too late. The room had shifted. Murmurs began. Someone from the front row, an elderly woman with a notepad, stood and asked why her grandchildren had developed rashes after swimming. Another questioned why fish populations had vanished from the east side. The meeting devolved into managed chaos, with officials insisting on order and residents demanding answers. William left before it ended, but he knew the effect had landed. The wall of silence had cracked. The following week, enforcement came dressed as cooperation. A representative from the state DEP arrived at William's door, this time with an offer. They were initiating a limited site review of the lake and surrounding infrastructure and wanted his cooperation in allowing surveyors to collect baseline data from his shoreline. It sounded benign, even helpful, but the phrasing was too careful, the timing too convenient. William agreed, but insisted all visits be documented and recorded, with access confined to pre-designated zones. He also retained a private environmental consultant to shadow the review. If they were going to frame the data, he would have his own version ready. That same consultant discovered something that startled even William: a shallow depression behind the property that registered elevated levels of hexavalent chromium in a soil scan, 10 times above state safety thresholds. It wasn't visible to the eye, and it had likely been buried for years. They marked the coordinates and flagged it for immediate hazard assessment. William sent the data to Karen, who escalated the findings to the federal branch of the EPA, bypassing the state. She didn't wait for permission. She knew now that waiting was exactly what the other side counted on. The final blow of the escalation didn't come in the form of a confrontation or a headline. It came quietly, in a revised zoning notice mailed to residents within 2 miles of the lake. The document, innocuous at first glance, contained a clause that would allow temporary control of lakefront property by state authorities in cases of confirmed environmental remediation. This would mean, in effect, that property owners like William could be removed from their land, temporarily but indefinitely, if contamination reached a threshold determined not by science but by administrative fiat. He read the notice twice, then burned it. Not out of panic, but out of understanding. The game was no longer about legality. It was about momentum. Whoever controlled the story controlled the outcome. But what the developers didn't understand, what the state hadn't yet accounted for, was that William had already shifted the burden. They were reacting now, not him. Every escalation revealed more of their machinery. Every attempt to isolate him strengthened the trail of truth he had meticulously documented. He wasn't alone. And for the first time, he sensed that they knew it. The rain started the day the federal team arrived. Not a violent storm, but a cold, unrelenting drizzle that soaked the land in a kind of gray inevitability. William stood on his deck, arms crossed, watching the convoy pull onto the main road. A pair of black SUVs, followed by a white environmental response truck marked with a subtle EPA seal. The lake behind him was silent, shrouded in mist, its surface broken only by the occasional drip from overhanging branches. He didn't smile. He didn't move, but he felt the shift. This moment wasn't a victory. It was a breach. Whatever came next would be harder, heavier, and irreversible. The agents were clinical, precise, and tight-lipped. They introduced themselves by last name only, flashed credentials that William studied more carefully than he let on, and immediately began unpacking equipment. Ground-penetrating radar, composite soil collectors, deep-water probes. They didn't ask permission to walk the perimeter. They had it already, authorized by a federal warrant obtained after Karen's escalation and the accompanying toxicology report William had helped compile. The state had been bypassed entirely. stripped of its jurisdiction by evidence strong enough to warrant federal intervention. And now the system had caught up, if only by force. What startled William wasn't their arrival, but the reaction it provoked. By the second day of the investigation, road access to 3 neighboring properties was suddenly blocked by temporary utility maintenance closures, with crews working conspicuously but producing no visible repairs. Local news stations that had ignored the issue for months were now broadcasting cautious updates, mentioning rumors of groundwater contamination and public concern over lakeside development. The language was passive, vague. No mention of the buried pipe, the buried hatch, or the chemical signatures found just feet from residential homes. But it was enough to break the seal. William received an email from an environmental journalist in Boston, another from a legal nonprofit in upstate New York offering representation in the event of eminent domain seizure. He declined both. He wasn't looking for protection. He was watching the clock. By the 4th day, the EPA discovered a secondary drainage system, undocumented, unmapped, and cleverly disguised as part of an old septic line that had never been active. Its outlet fed directly into the southern cove, where the water had always appeared a shade too dark, too still. The investigators traced the line back through a series of shallow burial trenches, beneath a parcel of land still technically zoned for agricultural buffer use. And there they found it. 4 sealed drums, rusted but intact, partially buried beneath the slabs of poured concrete. When opened under supervision, the air hissed. Inside, chemical waste, labeled not with names, but with codes. Codes linked eventually to a discontinued fire-retardant manufacturing process banned in the late 90s for its toxicity and resistance to biodegradation. That should have been the climax. That should have been the point at which everything snapped into place. But it wasn't. Because just as the federal team prepared to report their findings, a cease order arrived from the regional court, filed under emergency injunction. The claim: the EPA had exceeded its scope, and the investigation posed an unreasonable interference in state land management. William read the document, a dozen pages of bureaucratic hedging, and knew exactly where it had come from. Not the court itself, not the state, but the corporate backers of Midland Resource Solutions, the very entity that now stood to lose everything if the lake was declared hazardous and closed under federal statute. This was no longer just about pollution. It was about political leverage, about who controlled the narrative. The state officials who had ignored his reports were suddenly vocal, calling for a cooperative resolution, urging the public to refrain from judgment until the matter is fully understood. But the public had already decided. Residents once silent were now speaking up, and not to the local authorities. A mother posted photos online of her dog's chemical burns after swimming. A teacher shared a log of rashes and respiratory symptoms from her students during outdoor lessons by the water. These stories caught fire, and they didn't come from activists or outsiders. They came from people who had lived beside the lake their entire lives. Still, it wasn't enough. The court ordered the EPA to suspend operations pending a jurisdictional hearing. William watched as the equipment was packed up, as the investigators offered him guarded nods of apology. "You've done everything right," one of them said quietly. "Sometimes that's not enough, but it's a record, and records don't vanish." He didn't answer. He just stood there, watching as the convoy left the way it had come, slowly, under rain, vanishing into fog. But that night, something broke, not in him, but in the system. William received a call from Karen, this time breathless, shaken. "One of the drums," she said, "was leaking into a groundwater reservoir. The readings went public. The containment failed before they could secure it. The information spread faster than legal paperwork could bury it. Within hours, local news stations were reporting unconfirmed reports of long-term contamination, and a federal health advisory was issued recommending no fishing, swimming, or drinking from the lake until further notice. That wasn't just a warning, it was a trigger. The next morning, the governor's office issued a formal statement. The lake would be closed indefinitely. All development projects would be suspended pending a full environmental review. Residents would be offered free water testing kits and temporary relocation assistance if their wells tested above threshold levels. Midland Resource Solutions pulled its legal challenge within 48 hours. Their stocks dipped. Their lawyers vanished. And for the first time, the lake was named not as a development opportunity, but as a federal cleanup site. William didn't celebrate. He didn't speak to reporters. He watched from his deck as state contractors arrived, placing warning buoys along the water's edge, fencing off public access points, distributing flyers door to door. It wasn't vindication. It wasn't relief. It was just truth, finally forced into daylight, dragged from the mud and made visible. And, like all truths exposed too late, it came with no satisfaction. Only wait. The lake was silent still, but it no longer looked at peace. It looked wounded, and for the first time, William saw in it the mirror of everything that had been hidden, buried, and forgotten, not just in the water, but in the people, in the silence they had carried for years. Now, they couldn't look away. Neither could he. The lake was still. Not in the way it had been before when silence masked everything that was wrong, but in the way a place looks after the crowd leaves. Emptied, paused, unresolved. It had been 6 weeks since the shutdown order. The signs around Lake Fletcher now bore the red band of federal authority. Environmental hazard. No entry. Authorized personnel only. The water, once dotted with weekend canoes and the ripples of lazy swimmers, now lay untouched beneath a haze of early winter frost. William stood by his dock, or what remained of it, watching as contractors in hazmat gear moved in and out of the tree line, carrying equipment with sterile efficiency. Their presence no longer alarmed him. They weren't hiding. They weren't denying. They were there to clean. His cabin had become quieter than usual. He kept the windows closed now, the wood stove always burning. The trail cameras had been taken down weeks earlier. There was no longer any point. The men in the shadows had disappeared as quickly as they'd come. Whatever leverage they had tried to apply had collapsed under the weight of their own denial. The lawsuits evaporated. The warnings stopped. And William was no longer a target, but a symbol. It was a strange transformation, and one he didn't particularly welcome. The letters started coming in mid-November. Not threats, thank you notes, handwritten, typed, folded into envelopes with awkward stamps. Some came from people he barely knew. A woman who lived 3 miles east, near the old ranger station, thanked him for standing his ground. A former township clerk admitted that she had seen unusual zoning activity but hadn't known what to do. One note, unsigned, simply said, "You did what the rest of us were too afraid to start." William read each one, placed them in a shoebox, and said nothing. He didn't reply. He wasn't looking for gratitude. He was looking for closure. And yet closure never really came. The lake wouldn't be safe for years, maybe longer. The contamination had seeped deep, into soil layers and water tables and the root systems of trees that once framed the shoreline. There would be lawsuits, fines, statements made in press briefings by people who had never set foot on the dirt path behind his cabin. And even if the cleanup succeeded, the people would remember. They'd remember the children's illnesses, the lost pets, the silence from authorities who claimed oversight and gave none. They'd remember the black SUVs and the sudden vanishing of those who once smiled at gas stations and diners and township meetings. William considered leaving. The thought had come to him more than once, in the stillness between mail deliveries and the late-night sounds of the contractors working beneath floodlights. But he didn't. Not yet. The house, the land, the lake, they were part of something now. Something larger than property or privacy or peace of mind. They were evidence. Not just of wrongdoing, but of endurance. The lake hadn't died. It had been wounded, poisoned, ignored, but it hadn't died. He still walked the shoreline some mornings, avoiding the posted areas, staying near the tree line where the frost clung thick to the brush. Sometimes he found old debris, half-buried signs, rusted anchors, pieces of rope and plastic that no one had bothered to collect. He piled them by the trail, not because he believed it would fix anything, but because it was something he could control. He marked time not by seasons now, but by movement. What changed, who returned, which parts of the landscape healed and which stayed broken. On the first real snowfall, he found a new sign posted at the village entrance. Water Monitoring Station, established 2025, Community Watch Partnership. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't even well designed. But it meant someone else had stepped forward. Others had begun to speak. And that was enough. William returned home, lit the fire, sat at his desk, and opened the last envelope from the shoebox. Inside was a photo, grainy, clearly taken from a distance. It showed the gray boat from that first morning, the one with the unmarked barrels and the two silent men. On the back was a single sentence printed in faded ink. "You weren't supposed to see this, but thank you for not looking away." He stared at the image for a long time before placing it face down. The past didn't disappear just because people stopped talking about it. But sometimes, if you named it, if you held it up to the light long enough, it couldn't hide anymore. The lake would remain closed for 10 years. That was the timeline the EPA had settled on. A decade of remediation, testing, and slow restoration. William might never see it whole again, but he had seen the truth, and made sure others did too. That was enough. It had to be.